Every time before I start recording, I have a little dance party just to get myself in the spirit of things. But I tried to keep it in last time, and YouTube was like, you don't have rights to that music, which is absolutely fair enough. I did not. But they wouldn't even let me purchase them. It's not my fault for YouTube having music available. Sorry, I'll bleep that out. We're going to talk about Plato today, which is great. We love Plato, mostly, for the most part. Well, we don't love him, but we find him interesting. And this is something I've been thinking about for ages, literally since school. This idea is not technically my own. My teacher in school was the one who introduced me to this. Thank you, Miss Radici. I have been thinking about it for about 10 years, so thanks for bringing up the topic. We're going to talk about Plato, his allegory of the cave, and how it links to Greek language, because it kind of was the first time I really became aware that our language can limit our ability to think about certain concepts, or not even limit, but it might be playing a serious role in what we are able to consider. So, firstly, we're going to give a little bit of context. Plato, when are we talking about? What's happening at the time? Plato was living from around roughly 430 BC to 350 BC. And when you look into what's happening in Greece at the time, what is the state of the politics, everything's a mess. Everything, political turmoil, everything's a bit of a disaster. However, recently I have been starting to think every period of history I learn about seems to be, when you look into it, you're like, wow, everything's just a bit awful, actually. Everything seems to be quite messed up. I'm starting to think that, is there even any time which doesn't have political turmoil? Any place or time? I'm not really sure. My first thought would be Bhutan. I feel like Bhutan in my head is like the pinnacle of peaceful living and like a nation to aspire to. But I don't know much about Bhutanese history. Maybe they have like a really tumultuous past. I'm gonna have to go in, look that up. But yeah, Greece around this time, we're just coming to the end of the Peloponnesian War, while Plato is young. Peloponnesian War, I think, is like 30 years long and a bit of a disaster on several occasions. Not always, but on several occasions for Greece. I'm coming in from the future here because I made a really embarrassing mistake. I'm clearly like half getting confused and half talking about the Persian War, which happened like at the beginning of the century, started in like 499 BC, and the Peloponnesian War, which started in like 431 BC. Jesus. I haven't thought about a lot of this, like the facts of this, in 10 years. The Persian War is the Greeks combined, like the city-states of ancient Greece versus the Persians in Asia. The Peloponnesian War is a civil war, even though Greece as a whole entity doesn't really exist at the time, between the city-states of Athens and Sparta. So, yeah. Here we're talking Peloponnesian War, Athens versus Sparta, which is like democracy versus oligarchy, commerce, and like almost Athens is like more of what we would recognize as like a modern nation state, like a Western democratic, although we can debate about that another time, versus like an oligarchic military, more authoritarian kind of style state. That's the Peloponnesian War, and that's what we're talking about. It does not go very well. we have massive upheavals in Greece has been a democracy for several hundred years at this point. But during this period of time, that is really up for debate. During the Peloponnesian War, I can't remember what the name of the Sicily, something to do with Sicily. They basically have a big fat disaster, and some citizens in Athens are like, the reason we had this failure, this military failure, is because of our democracy. We have too much democracy. We need to get rid of it. So for a brief period, they replace it with some kind of oligarchy that lasts literally a couple of months. So they go back to something more pro-democratic. Then Athens gets invaded and defeated by Sparta, and Sparta rules the city with these 30 tyrants, I think they're called, for a period of time. Again, that doesn't last a super long time. I think only a few years. This is all happening while Plato is a teenager. And so, yeah, democracy is just in a bit of a shambles. They do then come back to some kind of more pro-democratic government until it finally is ended towards the end of I don't even know how you do the centuries backwards. It really confuses me once we get pre-0 and into the BCs. I start to get a bit confused about which way around you call them. But from 400 to 300, towards the end of that century, democracy is fully ended. Obviously, Plato is growing up during this time. He's witnessing this just political upheaval of coming in and out of democratic governments to being ruled by an oligarchy, being ruled by the 30 tyrants. He also, during his lifetime, has witnessed the death of his teacher, Socrates, who has, if you don't know, sort of committed suicide, but he was forced to do so by the state. They were like, you need to kill yourself, you're being too convincing, you're causing too much trouble by asking us all these deep philosophical questions, it's getting on our nerves, please just commit suicide. And he does, because he stands by his principles. And maybe that's a conversation for another time. But so this is kind of the background of what's been happening in Plato's life. As I think you'll be able to see, it definitely has an impact on the kind of philosophy that he's writing. But let's get into the Allegory of the Cave first, because I think that can show you the basis of Plato's philosophy. And yeah, I don't know, let's just do it. Okay, so the Allegory of the Cave is written in the Republic, which is one of Plato's most famous works. And yeah, let's tell the story, I guess. So he basically describes a situation where we have this cave, and there's prisoners chained in the cave, and they've been chained there since birth. This is a kind of philosophical thought experiment. Sometimes it's best just not to probe too far into, who is chaining babies into a cave, and how are they surviving in there? Who's feeding them? Valid questions. I don't have an answer for that. Maybe we don't need an answer. Let's just see what Plato has to say. So people have been chained in this cave since birth, and they're chained against this rock wall, and they're sitting staring at a wall of the cave. That's all they've seen their whole life. And behind them is a fire, and someone is putting little kind of stick figurines in front of the fire so that they cast shadows onto the wall in front of the prisoners. And to the prisoners have been watching these shadows play out different stories their whole life. To them, their experience of reality, their world is these shadows on the wall. That's all they've ever known. And they think that they are learning things. They think that they're, maybe there's a little stick figurine of a horse and it's going and meeting another horse and they become friends. And to these prisoners, that's knowledge that they've learned about the world. They're going, wow, that shadow horse has befriended this shadow horse. That's their entire experience. One day, one of the prisoners is able to break free. He breaks free from his chains. He turns around and he's blinded by the fire. But he realizes, oh, those shadows were only images of something which is more real. They were reflections or, shadows of something which actually exists in the world, which was being lit up by this fire. And this prisoner is able to leave the cave and he sees the sun for the first time. And the sun, he realizes in the story, is kind of like the ultimate form of, like, that is where information is coming from. Like, that is lighting up true things in the real world. Like, he goes out and he's able to see a real horse for the first time and realizing, like, oh, what I was experiencing back there in that cave, that was just a shadow. That was just a minor form of something that really exists in the world for the first time. And Plato uses this analogy to explain how we experience the world, how we live our lives, and that everything we see around us in the world is an imperfect shadow of something which truly exists somewhere else. I realize this may sound confusing initially. Let's talk about it. So in Plato's theory, you have this realm of the forms. Actually, let's not start there. So to explain what the allegory of the cave is teaching us, all we have to do is think about what it means to exist in this physical world. Everything that we see is, by necessity, always changing. I don't even know if that is the right place to start either. Let's start with the table thing. Okay. So, to explain what the allegory of the cave is teaching us, let's think about tables. This is something Plato also talks about. So, what makes a table a table? We might say it's got legs, it's got a flat surface on the top of it. How else would you describe a table? The thing is, that definition, it's got legs and a flat surface on the top. What's the difference then between a stool? But when I see a stool or I see a table, I know that they're different things. I know what's a table and I know what's a stool. So how do I know? How can I see different tables which might look very, very different, but I still know in my head that's a table or that's a chair? How can we have this consistent image or knowledge of what things are when the versions of them that we see in the world around us are always different? They're always changing. Well, Plato says that the reason for this is because somewhere out there in the world, there is an ideal form of a table. There is some pure essence of what it means to be a table. And every version of a table that we have experience with in the real world is just an imperfect shadow of what that real form, that real essence of what it means to be a table is. And this is true of everything, Plato thinks. it does get slightly unclear whether he thinks this is only true of more abstract concepts like justice and virtue and honor, or whether he actually, because he uses this example of the table, whether he actually thinks that it's true of every single object in the world as well. Like there is a form of the table, there is an ideal form of a chair that exists in his realm of the forms. So Plato's main argument is that it's the world that we are living in is this imperfect, changing, kind of shadow world, where everything is just an instantiation of a ideal form that exists out there in the realm of the forms somewhere. Yeah, for Plato, the whole of life is just about aiming for true knowledge of these forms. So because the forms are the only thing which is really real. Everything that we see, everything that's here in the real physical world is only an imperfect version of some true knowledge which we could acquire if we aim towards that, if we aim to learn about those ideal forms that underlie the experience that we have every day. He makes this distinction between episteme, which is knowledge, and that is something which can only really be said of these forms, which are unchanging and constant, and then doxa, which is opinion. And opinion is knowledge, but it's of imperfect things. It's of, if you learn about your table, you say, oh, well, my table is brown and has 4 legs and has a round surface on the top. That's not true knowledge of tables. And obviously this is a simplistic example, but it does start to matter when you think of things like virtue and duty. We can make observations and have opinions about duty and justice and virtue when we see examples in the real world. We can say, oh, this person acted in a just manner when they helped out their neighbor who was in need. But that's only, we're learning about shadows in this way, just as the prisoners are learning about the world through these kind of fake versions of what real objects are. For Plato we should all be aspiring to true knowledge, which would be knowledge of the ideal forms of things that exist in this realm of the forms. And already I think maybe we can see links to what was going on at the time in the political experience that Plato was going through, because you have this very clear distinction between wanting knowledge and certainty and information about, or wanting to be able to pin your experience onto these unchanging laws that exist in the world, in the realm of the forms. Then you have the contrast with the everyday experience of this tumultuous, changing world that we're all living in. But this is where the most fascinating thing comes for me, because Greek, unlike English, has 2 words for being. You've got gignomai and you've got eimi. And gignomai means being in a changing, becoming way. It's actually, I don't know if I've fully made this connection before, but it's actually quite like Spanish, where you have estar and ser. And one is for things which can change, like estar you use for location or emotions, and then ser is for like intrinsic attributes or things which don't change, except that in Greek we use eimi for, you can use eimi for location as well. You can say like ego eimi anthropos, like I am a human being, or I think you can say like ego eimi en, what city? Polis? Or we can just say in the city, like in Athens, Amy, like I am in Athens. What is city? I think it is polis, but I'm doubting myself. It's something to do with that. And then gignomai, you might have like it is night or it is becoming night, night falls, you would use gignomai in that sense. Or a battle happened in the city, where we might say like there was a battle in the city. We're using was, which is just the past tense of is. It's the same verb in English, but in Greek that would be, you would use the word gignomai because a battle happened, like there was a becoming, there was a changing in that situation. This distinction between a being in a changing, evolving way and a being in a constant way, to me it's so clear now. Like once it was pointed out to me, like this similarity or this ability for the language to make this distinction between being in a changing way and being in a stable way. Once you can make that distinction, it becomes far easier to start seeing that distinction in many ways and to make observations like the world that we see around us is always changing, it's always becoming. And perhaps it would signal to you, well, if I'm witnessing, the world around me in this being in a changing way, but I have this other word, I have this word Amy to describe being in a constant way, what might that refer to? And is there ever something which can exist in an unchanging way? Plato goes on to say, yes, there is. Like, that's what the realm of the forms is, and that's how we have this intrinsic knowledge of what it means for something to be a table or to be virtuous, because we have within us some innate knowledge of those things which exist in the realm of the forms. And this was the first time for me, like I said, where I really saw the power that language has over our ability to think in certain ways. It makes you start to question, what is there about my language which allows me certain patterns of thought and doesn't allow me others? I think you might have heard of the Sapir-Wharf hypothesis. This is basically exactly what we're talking about, that your experience of language dictates your experience of the world that you can have. We explain the world around us to ourselves through the medium of language. And if you don't have the ability to say a certain thing or to express a certain concept, it's very difficult to experience it. I'm going down so many different rabbit holes in my mind at the same time. What I wanted to get to was, that made me think of, so much. The Douglas Adams quote that's like, this race of people who discovered that the easiest way not to be unhappy was just not to have a word for it. If you can't express that you're unhappy, then maybe that the concept just doesn't exist and you go about your life enjoying yourself enjoying yourself, full stop, we'll end the sentence there.
I want to read you this quote because it's so good. Okay. It is, of course, perfectly natural to assume that everyone else is having a far more exciting time than you. Human beings, for instance, have a phrase that describes this phenomenon. The other man's grass is always greener. The Schautenac race of Bruttkingen 13 had a similar phrase, but since their planet is somewhat eccentric, botanically speaking, the best they could manage was, the other Schautenac's jupleberry shrub is always a more mauvey shade of pinky russet, and so the expression fell into disuse, and the Schautenacs had little option but to become terribly happy and contented with their lot, much to the surprise of everyone else in the galaxy, who had not realised that the best way to not be unhappy is just not to have a word for it.
There's another quote, I can't remember who it's by, that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. I'm gonna have to look that one up. And then the third thought, which I got lost in a rabbit hole down, was about, if anyone's seen the film Arrival, it's basically exactly about this kind of concept that I don't want to spoil it actually for any of you who haven't seen it, because I truly think it's one of the best films that exists ever. But it is about the same thing of that our ability to express a concept through language allows us access to a different experience, which makes sense. I guess I wonder whether anyone's ever written about the idea of language as another sense that we have access to. If you think of like bees being able to see in ultraviolet, their experience of the world is fundamentally different because they are allowed access to a different kind of light than we are able to process. Just in the same way, our experience is different from dogs, who also can see a different end of the visible light spectrum or a different portion of it. Our experience of reality day to day is going to be dictated by our ability to have access to that sense. And language in effect is another kind of sense. It's an ability to make sense. I've used the word sense too many times, but language is an ability to make sense of the world around you. And if your language prohibits expressing certain qualities, you might be able to have some other access to them, but I think it will be very hard to ever come to terms with that, understand what it really means. Language is often our method of exploration and explanation to ourselves and to other people about what it means to have a certain kind of experience. And if your language limits you in that way, then what are you meant to do about it? This is one of the reasons why I would really love to become fluent in another language. I am not, unfortunately. I have a very bad habit of starting learning languages and stopping for various reasons. I have taken lessons in so many languages at this point, and I could tell you anything from a few words in a language up to we can have a full discussion, but I'm so interested in which kinds of concepts become available to you once you have mastered a certain other language. And even my experience of learning a lot of ancient Greek has massively impacted the way that I am able to understand and express certain concepts. I just think that any kind of language, even a programming language, even learning different computer languages, was really impactful for the way I was able to think about different kinds of concepts, because you just now have a medium to express that concept in. I actually was considering doing another video in the future about that, because this is a really nerdy topic to think about, but there's certain languages, programming languages, which have a feature called object orientation, where you use classes of object, and then you can build like instantiations of those particular classes. This might not make sense and definitely needs a longer explanation. But the concept that is expressed in these programming languages actually relates to lots of things that I see in the real world. Like, I start to see instances of this happening in other completely separate different mediums, like in the way we interact, in just physical objects, in...
Hello again from a slightly different, further on future version of me, but I just realised as I'm going through this that object instantiation, object-oriented programming is actually the perfect analogy for Plato's realm of the forms, and I kind of wish I'd explained it in more detail, because in object-orientation you have object-oriented programming, you have like this class of an object which describes like the bare properties, the minimum properties that a particular object has to have, and then you instantiate that class in various forms. So the example they always give you when you're first learning to code with a language like Java, which is object oriented, is you have like a class of an animal, and then it can be instantiated in multiple forms, like a lion or a dog, but they all share some core properties which they inherit from that original class of an animal. And that's literally exactly what Plato is saying in the realm of the forms. He's saying you've got this original form, you've got a table, you've got the bare attributes of what it means to be a table, or what it means for something to be virtuous, and then in the physical world that gets instantiated in various ways, but all of those versions of it are kind of like an imperfect changing form. I keep using the word form, that's not helpful, but they're instantiated in like changing ways, but none of them is that true essence which is captured in the original form, which in Java would be the class which it inherits from. So any niche crossover, if there's anyone watching who programs in Java and is interested in ancient Greek philosophy, do let me know. Or maybe I'm the only one. Hopefully not, but you never know.
And I was able to see that and make that connection was through becoming acquainted with the programming language in a completely different context. It wasn't like I set out to learn the language with the hope I would start to see connections in other like places in life. You learn the language just to learn the language, or for whatever your reason is, to be able to express everyday things. But then you start to realize that it's shaping the way you're able to interpret the world around you as well. You suddenly have access to whole new methods of thought, literally whole new pathways of thought. And I guess physically it even makes sense. Biologically, you're building new pathways in your brain when you learn to speak a new language. You're connecting more neurons and you simply have more routes to go down in your brain. So maybe that's why, or maybe that's linked to how it allows you to express new concepts or access new concepts. You are literally just covering more internal mental territory. I wonder if there's a maximum number of neurons that's possible for a human brain to have. I wonder who has the maximum number of neurons, because I wonder if that is even connected to intelligence, or like presumably there is like a map of like a fairly linear straight line of like more neurons, somewhat more intelligence, but I don't think it would. Maybe it isn't linear actually. Maybe there comes a point when more neurons actually becomes a hindrance and you start to not ever know which route to go down in your head. This has got very off topic. I'm sorry, you're just being let into my internal monologue now. The point was Plato and Amy and Gignomai. But was that really the point? Maybe the point was the language point. I think it probably was. Returning back to Plato and the allegory of the cave. So the cave is meant to represent the physical world. It's a world of appearances. It's the shadow world. We're only seeing things as they're kind of projected to us, and they're imperfect images of something which does really exist somewhere else. Then the man's journey out of the cave, for Plato, that is the journey which is available to all of us through the discipline of philosophy. And philosophy is like the quest for knowledge. I mean, literally in Greek, it's a love of wisdom. You're on the search for what is true, what is real. And so this man's journey from the world of appearances out into the real world, out into the light of the sun, represents the journey that we can all go on by questioning and trying to aim for this knowledge of the forms that exist. Plato also has one particular form which he thinks is like the highest form. It's the form of the good, and it almost sort of acts in a bit of a godlike way, although I think Plato has his own kind of prime mover thing going on, which I'm going to have to check that. But the form of the good in the allegory of the cave is the sun. Without the form of the good, we would have access to nothing, because everything that we experience is always experienced in relation to what is good, true, truth, honesty, love. All of these things would sit as subcomponents within what is the form of the good. The form of the good is kind of the highest overarching umbrella form that everything else sort of sits within. And there was no conclusion really to what I wanted to tell you. It wasn't like I had some big point that I was aiming to get towards. I just wanted to talk about this because I think about it all the time, and I'd like to get it out of my head. That's the truth with all of these videos, is these are just thoughts which are going around in my head constantly, and it's actually quite satisfying to just have them out, and then I can sort of let them go a little bit. I don't have to just keep reciting and going over the same kind of thoughts. Maybe when I finish, maybe I'll just make a whole bunch of videos and I'll have no thoughts left in my head. That actually sounds quite nice, quite peaceful. Anyway, I hope you're all having a wonderful week, a wonderful time, and maybe I'll see you again. We shall see.